Hi folks! Today, as a follow-up to my Historic Jesus video, we're going to be asking a very crucial question. What did Jesus eat? Here on Lessons from the Purple Chair. Hi folks, and welcome back to Lessons from the Purple Chair. One intellectual's musings from the comfort of a big purple wingback. It's been a long time since I've been on here, a little over a year, and I apologize for that. But however, I'm going to plan to be doing a lot more videos upcoming. So, bear with me. And speaking of videos, my last one was the Historic Jesus, which went over pretty well. And because of that video, I started thinking about it. And one of the major thoughts I kept having was, what did Jesus eat? Which I know would be a little bit of an odd question to ask, but seriously, their old saying is, what you are what you eat. Well, and I actually agree with that because every single one of us eats from a certain culture, from a certain background, from a certain region, and it dictates what our diet will be. And because of that, it kind of dictates who we are, because eating is such a huge part of our communities and our cultures. That, for instance, I'm from Eastern Kentucky, and we have a very certain cuisine, soup beans and cornbread and fried chicken, basically everything that's fried. But that is as much a signature as someone from France who would be croissants and and the baguettes and all of their dishes. And and as we know, that food for both where I'm from and from France dictates a lot and tells you a lot about the person and their culture. Well, as we all know, Jesus Christ was a very important person and very important in people's lives, as about 2 billion people on planet Earth worship him as God. So I think that brought up the natural curiosity as to, if you sat and broke bread with him, and more on bread in a minute, but what would be on the table? What would be his favorites? I think that tells a lot about a person, a lot about the man. So I did a lot of research on this, and which wasn't always so easy to find, and it's brought up some very interesting and fascinating topic here. So let's get into it, okay? First thing we have to do when we consider what did Jesus eat is look at the time and the place in which he lived. And of course, Jesus was from Israel in the 1st century AD. So therefore, we have to look at the region as well as the culture and cultural influences on his diet. And actually, it's quite fascinating. Um, Now, one of the first ingredients in Jesus' diet, which would have been a staple meal for him, something he would eat every day, probably several times a day, and is even mentioned in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. And yes, bread was the staple for the community. That's what everybody ate. In fact, it's a staple for every civilization of the ancient world, from the Egyptians to the Babylonians to the Romans. Bread was the staple meal, and actually, it's a little bit of a brilliant invention by man that's often overlooked. Is bread. You're basically taking a cereal, either wheat or barley. You're grounding it into a flour, mixing it with water with a little bit of salt, and then bake it. And what you end up with is a very dense, highly nutritious carbohydrate that does not need refrigeration. Will keep for several days before it molds. And will basically give a human being all the nutrients they need. So therefore, all these great civilizations were built on the production of bread. Bread is the life. So, and of course, with at the time of Jesus, he would have one of his major meals or major staple part of his diet would have been bread. And because we're on that, the next ingredient in the building of ancient civilizations uh, cause a little bit of a mystery because it's not really mentioned much in the Bible, and that is beer. Actually, not technically, it's not beer; it's ale, because beer is a combination of barley mixed with hops, and that's something that didn't come up until way up until the Middle Ages in Europe. So, but now if you're using fermented barley and boiling that down, that is technically an ale. So, and everybody in the ancient world, from Sumer to Egypt to they drank they drank ale. Uh, in fact, in the Egyptian prayer from a most common man that built a tomb all the way up to the Pharaoh was, "Give me bread, beer, onions, and all good things," because bread and beer was just the food and diet of everyone. It's fairly cheap to produce. It gives you all the nutrients you need, um, and it will sustain you. You will thrive on it. Now it's a little bit low um, in protein and vitamin C, but if you're eating bread and beer and you have a piece of cabbage or a piece of fruit and maybe once a week a fried fish, you can survive and thrive. So this was the staple food of ancient times, but in the Bible, it causes a little bit of a problem because, as I said, it's not mentioned. It does not mention them drinking beer. So, which has always made me wonder. They speak of wine, but they never speak of beer. And I had to do some research on this, but I found actually they were drinking quite a bit of beer. In the Bible, especially in both the Old Testament and in the letters of Paul, they speak of strong drink. And the word that they're using is shekar, and shekar basically means any type of alcohol that's not produced from grape. In other words, any type of alcohol that's not technically wine, whether it be from grains or whether it be from other fruits or from honey. Um, but that is called a shekar, which is translated as strong drink. And of course, or it can even mean distilled alcohol. However, we know that in the ancient world they didn't start distilling until the Arabs came in. So there was no whiskey at the time or bourbon or any of that. So when they're talking of shekar, they are talking of beer or ale. They're talking about drinking ale, and they drink quite a bit of it. Now, one of the myths that has become very popular, especially in the Christian community, in the last about 150 years, is that, oh, well, when they talk of Jesus drinking wine or he changed the water into wine, it really wasn't wine. It was much weaker. It was basically just a fruit juice that wouldn't get you drunk. Um, and actually, unfortunately, that is wrong. That is that was something that was brought by the teetotalers that become popular at the turn of the last century to kind of excuse why the Bible talks about them drinking so much wine and the miracles of Jesus and the communion. Um, but in truth, the alcohol they drank was fairly strong. In fact, they are correct in that the alcohol content was not as high um, as we have today. But the average wine today has an alcohol content of about 18%. In the ancient world, it was about 15%. So slightly lower, but still very much to get you plastered. So it was still a very was still a very strong drink. Now, one part of that rumor, which is true, is that they did have a weaker form of ale that most people drank. Now, in Europe, not so much in the Middle East, but in Europe, the over farming and fertilization of their fields had contaminated their water, and you really couldn't drink water. And in fact, throughout most of the world, the ancient world, water could kill you. I mean, water has parasites in it, it has bacteria in it, and they didn't know to boil water. They didn't know about this, but they knew that drinking water could make you sick. So most people did not drink water, straight water. They drank ale because the alcohol was killing the parasites and the bacteria and things in the water. Um, but don't think that everybody was just walking around drinking beer all day and walk around plaster all the time. No, they had a weaker form of beer, or well, a day beer as they called it, um, that basically when they run the wort, which is a bag of fermented grains that they boil up and run off, that would give you your first hardcore beer or ale. And but then they would fill it the used bag up with water again and run it again. Well, that second run, most of the alcohol's been taken out, and there'd be enough alcohol in it um, to kill the germs and things in the water, and it would get the taste of ale, but you would have to drink like 3 gallons of it to get a head buzz. And that's what most people drank during the day, was this very watered down, really it's a near beer, or near ale. Um, that's what most people drink during the day, and then at night you went for the first run heavy stuff. Um, but the mystery to me is that in Israel there doesn't seem to have been a problem with the water, which may have been why they don't mention them drinking beer so often, um, or ale so often. In fact, Jesus, when he goes to the well, asks for the lady to get him a drink of water. You wouldn't have got that in England. You wouldn't have got that in France. So apparently the water in that part of the world must have been fairly safe, at least the well water. So that's probably the reason we don't have so much of an ale culture going on there. But they definitely did drink ale. Um, Wine was considered the much more preferred drink, uh, and and wine we've known about wine in the Bible going back to Noah. The first thing he did when he got when the flood was over was plant grapes, make wine, get drunk, and pass out naked. So, the wine had been used in that part of the world for a very long time, for thousands of years. And wine was very popular in Israel at the time. And they got wine from other countries. We know that Herod the Great sent for from wines from Greece and from Rome, which would have been far too expensive for most people to have drank. But there was a domestic brand that was being put out in Western Judea, which was most likely the wine that was used in the communion Last Supper, and also probably the type of wine um, that Jesus would have uh, turned the water into into the wine. And but yes, wine was still very popular, and of course Jesus, one of his miracles was turning water into wine, and it was used in his communion. So. But the wine that they drank then, the one from Western Judea, it said that it was much sweeter wine than the wines we have today. Um, it was a lot more. It was a red wine and a lot more robust. So, but yeah, but wine would have been drank, but wine would have still been much more expensive. So they would have probably drank water. Fruit juices were also very popular, like pomegranate juice, um, or possibly some ale. So, but yeah, but wine was definitely a staple there. Um, but then we get into, well, what do they eat? Now we've talked about the drinks, and today most people, when they sit up their dinner table, the main appetite the main part of the meal would be meat. Unfortunately, from what we can tell, meat, which was very expensive, was not was not eaten for every meal. In fact, it was very rare to have meat, maybe a couple times a week if you were lucky. Um, but they did, and when they did eat meat, the most popular meat, of course, was fish. And of course, we have examples of fish from Jesus' time. He lived in Galilee, near the Sea of Galilee, which there that would give easy and cheap access to fish. Um, the When he performed the miracle of the two fish and 5 loaves and fed the multitudes. Um, that would have been that would have been dried fish. Now I know in Jesus of Nazareth they had these raw fish they were pulling out, and I always kind of like that doesn't seem right, and it's not right. And the chosen they got it right because the chosen it is dried fish. This fish would have been dried because there was no refrigeration, and they're not walking around carrying raw fish around. So it would have been dried fish, and dried fish would have been a staple part of their diet. Um, but there, but there are other meats that they would have had. Well, first with the fish, there were 3 types of fish from the Sea of Galilee. There was tilapia, there was carp, and there was catfish. Now, catfish, unfortunately, due to the dietary laws, could not be eaten. It says that not to eat anything in the waters that did not have fins and did not have scales, and catfish do not have scales, so that would have been an unkosher fish. So the most likely the fish that they used in the miracle of the fish and loaves was most likely either a tilapia or a carp, and it was dried fish. Other meats that they have that are mentioned in the Bible was in one of the stories by Christ. He speaks of the story of the prodigal son. They speak of the fatted calf. Um, so obviously they ate beef. However, the story insinuates, is eating beef was a luxury and a very expensive. It's something that most people would not of the time would have been far too poor to have been partaking of. And also in that same story, we have another example of meat eaten, and that would have been goat. The aggravated son at the end says, "You kill the fatted calf for my brother that went out and spent all your money, but for me, you won't even give me a young goat to eat with my friends." So obviously, the fatted calf and the goat, which was a lesser meat but still horribly expensive, were eaten during the time. Um, and also another meat that was eaten, especially as Seder, would have been lamb, and lamb was super expensive. So these were saved for holy holidays before they'd be eaten. But most of the time, um, the only meat they really got was fish. And that was pretty much throughout Israel, but especially in Galilee, where it was a major food source. Um, Now, as far as the vegetables at the time, which was the most common part of a person's diet, well, they actually had a good selection of vegetables. Um, they had leeks, they had cucumbers, they had mustard greens, they had peas, they had marrow, they had garlic, they had onions, and even more importantly, they had olives. Olives was another big staple of food for the time and in the area. Everyone ate olives. Everyone grew olives. In fact, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Gethsemane actually means an olive oil press. So the garden they were in is actually named after an olive oil press. But everyone ate olives either raw or cooked or pickled. They were used in most recipes. So so olives was a major part of their diet. In fact, most people at the time ate 2 meals a day. The first meal was a much smaller meal, probably a breakfast meal, and much more simple, and most likely were made up of bread, probably some ale or fruit juice, and olives, and maybe some cheese, which I'll go into cheese in a minute. But That would have been their first meal. Then they would have had the heavier meal later on in the day or towards evening. Um, but the taste of onions, of course, onions, like I said, from the Egyptian times, we know that onions, their prominence. They had green onions as well as yellow onions that they grew. Um, Onions was a major part of their diet. Uh, but as Also from olives, they got olive oil. And olive oil was a very important ingredient in that part of the world because they used olive oil for cooking. Use olive oil for any type of industrial lubrication to lube something up, and they also used it to burn in the oil lamps. So they produced a lot of olive and a lot of olive oil, and actually it was used as a dip with your bread. In fact, one of the reasons that I did this video, and what got it going in my head is a verse from the Bible, from the New Testament, where one of the at the Last Supper table, one of the disciples asks Jesus, "Who will betray you?" And he says, "It is the one who dips after me." So in other words, he's taking a piece of bread and dipping in something, and then the next person that dipped was his betrayer, which we know was Judas. I've always wondered what what were they dipping in? What were they dipping? And that curiosity, I'm like, what were they dipping there in the meal? And actually, now I know there is an archaeologist who did a major study of what was had been eaten at the Seder dinner of Passover, and he figured out a lot from a lot of research what was being eaten, and most likely what they were dipping in was olive oil mixed with hyssop. Now hyssop is a flower, and it kind of gives a licorice taste, and they mix that in. And so most likely what Jesus was dipping into with this piece of unleavened bread um, what was olive oil mixed with hyssop. And that's another thing about the bread is that you had two types of bread um, that they would commonly eat. You had the wheat bread, and then you had barley bread. And barley bread was the most common. It was cheaper. And then you had the unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is bread that's not had yeast added to it to cause it to rise. So it's the flat pita types of bread, and that would have been the type that they were dipping with. But the most common, and it was probably a white bread because it was Passover. But the rest of the time, Jesus probably ate a barley bread, one of the cheapest of breads. Um, but the as far as um, uh, um, other ingredients we could talk about is cheese. And cheese would have been another staple of their diet. Once again, this is something that can be made. It doesn't necessarily need to be refrigerated, or at least not away. It has some shelf life, and it would have been commonly eaten. We know that they had the cows and they had goats, and they produced a lot of cheese because even though for dairy they had milk and they had butter and they made yogurt. Milk itself does not. Basically, it's a right away immediate eat. You have to immediate consumption. You have when you basically when you squeeze it out, you've got to drink it because milk's not going to keep. So therefore, they made it into cheese and yogurt and probably some butter um, which had a little bit of shelf life and staying power, and of course yogurt and cheese are a big part of the recipes at the time. So um, now, as far as things that were sweet to the taste, um, basically reminds me of not only what Jesus ate, but the things he would have never saw and never knew existed, and which is equally fascinating to me. For instance, we know that Jesus would have never known potatoes, tomatoes, or corn or sugarcane. They were unknown in his world. Those are all from the Americas. Actually, tomatoes are from Mexico. Potatoes are from North America. corn originally came from South America but moved into North America. But these are all American ingredients. Uh, all commodities from the New World, and they weren't introduced into the rest of the world until the post-Columbian period, which is after the late into 1400s. So, so Jesus would have never had tomato sauce. He would have never had mashed potatoes. He had never had corn on the cob, and he had never known that super sweet taste of sugar. The most sweets of that time and in that region came from either honey or from fruit. And as far as honey, uh, there was there were beekeepers and beehives and that did produce honey in Israel, but it wasn't a huge commodity. It wasn't, and therefore, it would have been a little more rare to get a hold of. That's what made it more expensive. And most of the time in the New Testament and even in the Old Testament, when they're talking about honey, they're talking about date honey. And date honey technically isn't really a honey. It, it's because it's made from dates. And basically, what they did is they pressed dates down mush until it turned to a liquid, and then which had a taste like honey. So that's what they used. So, and as fruits, they had pomegranates, they had lemons, that they had melons like watermelon and honeydew. So and really that though and they also had dates. So those were the sweets that brought any type of sweet taste in there. So basically, if we do a review of the diet of Jesus, which was really a Mediterranean diet. It's a pretty good diet and a fairly tasty diet. I mean, they've got fish and lamb and goat and beef and they've got bread and yogurt and garlic and leeks. It's actually a fairly good and tasty and healthy diet. But of course, it's much better when you add some spice. And speaking of the spices, unlike in Europe, where the climate didn't allow to grow these exotic spices, in Israel it's quite different because of the climate. They had much more flavorful and zesty spices. One of the oldest that they had it was coriander, and coriander is actually mentioned in Exodus because when God brought the manna from heaven, they said it was white and looked like coriander. So coriander had been used for thousands of years, but even more than that, Christ Himself He mentions three spices in the New Testament. He mentions dill, cumin, and mint. Um, which those are also, and in fact, they were even being taxed by the temple, which is what he's criticizing at the time. But those were common spices. Of course, they also had black pepper, which is probably the hottest spice that they had, and also that you have salt. So, um, and now another big part of the diet was the legumes, basically the beans, and they were a big part of the staple of the diet. You had chickpeas, you had fava, and you had fava beans, and you had lentils. And lentils have been known in the ancient world for thousands of years. In fact, Esau, the meal that was prepared for his brother, caused him to surrender his birthright. So lentils have been around for a long time. So if you take all of that into account, it's a pretty good diet. It's a pretty healthy diet, and with the spices, the coriander, the cumin, the pepper, it would have actually been very tasty. Prepare some very tasty meals. Now, one thing we do have to consider when we consider the diet of Christ is the dietary laws. Of course, pork was off the menu. Everybody knows that there is no pork or pork products. Also, there was rules against eating dairy with meat. So, and also food was to be separated into separate containers. So that's probably the reason that they were dipping a lot. They take bread because you didn't have like a plate with everything on it. You had bowls sitting around, and people would take bread, as what they still commonly do in the Middle East. They break off a piece of bread and they would dip into the food. So that way they weren't mixed together. And also, there's with this rule against eating dairy with meat, you would not have had certain recipes. You would not have had like a yogurt dip that was sitting there, because of the meat that you're eating also at the table. If it was separated out. Um, you wouldn't have had any type of creams or all of that put on meat. So it does limit what Jesus would have ate and the type of recipes that he would have known. So it would so and the eating experience that you were eating and from multiple containers using bread, getting a dip of this, getting a dip of that, getting getting some of the dip of olive oil, and you were eating that. So all in all, it was a pretty good and pretty good and spicy meal, and a very healthy one. It's pretty much a Mediterranean diet. Well, that's all that I have for the diet of Jesus. I hope it was as enlightening to you as it was to me, because food and the way we eat food, and it reflects our community. It reflects the culture we come from, and therefore is a big part of our personality. And when we think of Christ, we can think of some very healthy Mediterranean dishes that he would have enjoyed. Well, folks, that's all I've got for what Jesus ate. I think that it's turned out to be a very, very good and healthy diet, and a very tasty diet. What else would you expect for the Son of God, right? And folks, if you're enjoying my channel, please go down and hit that subscription button. I'd love you here at the lessons from the Purple Chair. And I apologize for being gone for over a year, but I had some technical problems, mostly with the Purple Chair. Because this isn't the old purple chair that I used to have. That chair has been retired. It got worn out. And technically, this chair isn't purple. I've just got this purple cover on it. So technically, it makes it a purple chair. But little things like that kept me from doing these videos. But I've pretty much stopped doing videos for Big Pretty Man, and now I'm just doing them for Lessons from the Purple Chair. So, and I've got a whole lineup of videos I'm going to be doing. So please stay tuned, and I promise to have another video up soon. So until then, find a comfy chair, find a good book, and pursue your passions. Later.